You know that moment when you realize you've been underestimating someone? Well, my HOA president, Margaret Thornfield, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. She thought she could bully my family with her ridiculous parking restrictions, but she had no idea my quiet, mild-mannered father controlled the financial lifelines of half our neighborhood. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who smile politely while holding all the cards. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from today. My name is James Harrington, and until 6 months ago, I thought the biggest problem in my life was deciding between Netflix shows after work. I lived in Willowbrook Estates, one of those picture-perfect suburban communities where every lawn is manicured to perfection, and the HOA rules are thicker than a phone book. My wife, Sarah, and I had bought our dream home there 3 years earlier, a beautiful two-story colonial with a circular driveway that could easily fit 4 cars. Everything was peaceful until Margaret Thornfield got elected as HOA president. Margaret was the kind of woman who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and called violations in for Christmas decorations left up past January 2nd. She had this way of smiling sweetly while delivering the most unreasonable demands, as if coating poison with honey made it medicine. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in March. I was getting ready for work when I heard our doorbell ring at exactly 7:30 a.m. Sarah answered it while I was upstairs brushing my teeth, and I could hear Margaret's sickeningly sweet voice drifting up from the foyer. "Good morning, Sarah, dear. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but we need to discuss your family's parking situation." I quickly finished up and headed downstairs, finding Margaret standing in our entryway with her clipboard and measuring tape, her weapons of choice. She was immaculately dressed in a powder blue pantsuit, not a hair out of place, but her eyes had this predatory gleam that made my skin crawl. "James, perfect timing," she said, flashing that fake smile. "I was just explaining to Sarah that we've received several complaints about your family's parking habits." "Complaints?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What kind of complaints? We park in our own driveway." Margaret's smile grew wider, which somehow made it more menacing. "Well, that's exactly the issue. According to HOA regulation, March 7th, 15, residential driveways are designated for homeowner vehicles only. Your parents have been parking their car in your driveway during their visits, which constitutes a violation of guest parking protocols." I stared at her in disbelief. My parents lived about 30 minutes away and visited us twice a week. My mom helped Sarah with our newborn daughter Emma while I was at work, and my dad usually stopped by on weekends to help with yard work. They'd been parking in our driveway for 3 years without anyone saying a word. "Margaret, they're family, not guests, and our driveway can fit 4 cars easily. We're not blocking anyone or causing any problems. The regulation doesn't distinguish between family and guests, James. All non-resident vehicles must park on the street or in designated visitor spaces." She consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "I've documented 17 violations in the past month alone." Sarah stepped forward, holding baby Emma a little tighter. "Mrs. Thornfield, my mother-in-law comes over to help with the baby while James is at work. She's elderly and has arthritis. Making her park on the street and walk the extra distance seems unnecessarily cruel." Margaret's expression didn't soften one bit. "Rules are rules, dear. If we make exceptions for one family, where does it end? Next thing you know, everyone will be claiming special circumstances." I felt my jaw clench. "Show me exactly where this regulation is written." Margaret flipped through several pages on her clipboard before pointing to a small paragraph buried in subsection 15. The text was so convoluted and buried in legal jargon that I was amazed she'd even found it. It technically did say what she claimed, but it was clearly one of those rules that had never been enforced. "This rule hasn't been enforced in the 3 years we've lived here," I pointed out. "Why start now?" "New administration, new standards," Margaret replied crisply. "I ran on a platform of strict adherence to community guidelines, and the residents elected me to maintain our neighborhood's prestigious standards." She handed me an official-looking document. "This is your formal notice. You have 7 days to ensure compliance, or you'll face escalating fines. First offense is $150, second offense is $300, and it doubles from there. Repeated violations can result in legal action and potential foreclosure on your home. My blood ran cold. Foreclosure? Over parking. The HOA has the legal authority to place liens on non-compliant properties, James. It's all clearly outlined in your homeowner agreement. Her smile was absolutely triumphant now. I do hope we can resolve this amicably. After she left, Sarah and I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the notice. The language was intimidating and official, full of legal threats and references to bylaws and community standards. For the first time since buying our home, I felt genuinely afraid of losing it. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Your parents shouldn't have to park on the street. Your mom can barely walk as it is." I looked out our front window, at our spacious driveway. Plenty of room for multiple cars, causing absolutely no problems for anyone. This wasn't about parking or community standards. This was about power, and Margaret Thornfield had just declared war on the wrong family. The next morning, I decided to do some research. If Margaret wanted to play by the rules, I was going to make sure I knew every single one of them. I spent my lunch break at work reading through the entire HOA agreement, all 89 pages of dense legal text that I'd foolishly skimmed when we first bought the house. What I discovered was eye-opening. The parking regulation Margaret had cited was indeed real, but it was buried in a section about commercial vehicle restrictions and seemed to be intended for things like work trucks and delivery vehicles, not family cars. More importantly, there were dozens of other regulations that I was certain weren't being enforced uniformly throughout the neighborhood. I started keeping a notebook. Every day after work, I'd take walks through Willowbrook Estates with my phone camera, documenting violations. Mrs. Patterson, at 1247 Oak Street, had been running an unlicensed dog grooming business from her garage for 2 years. Clear violation of Regulation 8. 2.1 regarding home-based businesses. The Johnsons, at 1156 Maple Drive, had installed a hot tub without HOA approval, violating Regulation April 3, 12 about structural modifications. The list went on and on. But the most interesting discovery came when I noticed Margaret's own house. Her precious rose garden extended nearly 3 feet into the community easement, violating Regulation 6. 1.5 about property boundary encroachment. Her husband's classic car collection took up half their backyard, stored under tarps that violated Regulation February 8, 11 about unsightly storage materials visible from neighboring properties. Margaret Thornfield was violating at least 6 HOA regulations while selectively enforcing others against families she didn't like. When Saturday came, my parents arrived for their usual visit. I watched from the window as my 72-year-old mother slowly got out of their car, using her cane to steady herself. The sight of her struggling made my decision easy. They were parking in our driveway. Period. Margaret must have been watching too, because exactly 37 minutes later, she was at our front door again. "James, I can see your parents' vehicle is still in your driveway. This is your second violation." "I know exactly what this is, Margaret." I handed her my own clipboard. I'd learned to play her game. "Before we discuss my supposed violations, I'd like to report several actual violations I've documented throughout the neighborhood." Her smile faltered slightly as I began reading from my list. Property boundary encroachment at 1189 Birch Lane. That's your address, isn't it, Margaret? Unlicensed business operation at 1247 Oak Street. Unapproved structural modifications at 1156 Maple Drive. "James, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular is selective enforcement of HOA regulations," I interrupted. "I have photographic evidence of dozens of violations throughout this community that have been ignored for years. Yet somehow, my elderly parents parking in my own driveway is a community crisis requiring immediate action." Margaret's face was turning red, her composed mask slipping. "Your attitude is noted, Mr. Harrington. 2 violations now on record." "Fine. Send me the fine notice. But I'll be submitting formal complaints about every single violation I've documented, starting with yours. And I'll be requesting a full board review of your enforcement practices." After she left, I called an emergency meeting with my parents. Mom and Dad came over that evening, and I laid out everything that was happening. My mother was upset, apologizing for causing trouble. But my father, quiet, methodical dad, who worked as a senior loan officer at First National Bank, just sat there, listening with an expression I'd rarely seen. "This Margaret woman," he finally said. "What's her last name again?" "Thornfield. Why?" Dad pulled out his phone and spent several minutes typing. His expression grew more and more interesting as he read whatever he was finding. "James," he said slowly, "I think you should know something about your HOA president. Margaret Thornfield and her husband took out a significant mortgage refinance with our bank 18 months ago. Their leverage to the Hilt second mortgage, home equity line of credit, the works." He showed me his phone screen displaying what looked like internal bank records. "They owe $847,000 on a house that's maybe worth $650,000 in the current market. They're underwater and struggling to make payments." "Is that legal for you to tell me that?" Dad smiled, an expression I definitely inherited from him. "I'm not sharing confidential client information, son. I'm simply noting that public records show they've had 3 different mortgage modifications in the past 2 years. Anyone could look that up." My mother looked confused, but I was starting to understand. "Dad, what exactly do you do at the bank?" "I am the senior loan officer who approves or denies mortgage modifications, refinancing applications, and payment deferrals for the entire Tri-County area." His smile widened. "I also sit on the committee that decides which properties go into foreclosure proceedings." The pieces were clicking into place. "How many families in this neighborhood bank with First National?" "About 60% of Willowbrook Estates, including most of the HOA board members." Dad leaned back in his chair, looking more like a chess master than the mild-mannered banker I'd always known. "It's amazing how many people don't read the fine print when they sign loan agreements, especially the clauses about maintaining good standing in their communities." I stared at him. "Dad, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything improper, James. I'm simply noting that banks have a legitimate interest in ensuring their borrowers maintain stable, harassment-free living situations. Excessive legal troubles or community disputes can be considered risk factors." My mother finally spoke up. "Honey, I still don't understand what this means." Dad patted her hand gently. "It means, dear, that sometimes bullies need to learn that they're not the only ones who can play hardball. Monday morning, I received Margaret's promised fine notice in the mail, $300 for 2 parking violations, with a stern warning that continued noncompliance would result in legal action. The letter was professionally typed on official HOA letterhead, complete with threats about property liens and foreclosure proceedings. That same afternoon, my father made some phone calls. I didn't know exactly what he said or to whom, but by Thursday, Margaret's husband, Derek, called me directly. His voice was shaky, almost panicked. "James, hi. This is Derek Thornfield from down the street. I was wondering if we could have a conversation about this parking situation between you and Margaret." "Sure, Derek. What's on your mind?" "Well, I think maybe my wife got a little carried away with the enforcement thing. Maybe we could work something out." This was interesting. Margaret hadn't sent Derek. He was acting on his own, which suggested something had spooked him badly. "I'm open to reasonable discussion, but your wife has been pretty clear that rules are rules." Right, but see," Derek's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "We got this letter from our bank today. Something about reviewing our loan terms due to excessive community involvement in legal disputes. They want to meet with us next week." I had to admire my father's subtlety. He hadn't done anything unethical or illegal. Banks routinely review loans when borrowers become involved in legal actions, especially if those actions might affect property values or community stability. But the timing was certainly coincidental. "That sounds stressful, Derek. Loan reviews can be complicated." "Yeah, and the thing is, we're kind of stretched thin financially right now. This house, it's been a bigger investment than we expected." He paused. "Look, what if Margaret just forgot about this parking thing? Would that make the bank stuff go away?" "Derek, I don't think there's any connection between HOA disputes and bank reviews," I said carefully. but I do think reasonable people can usually find reasonable solutions to neighborhood issues. That weekend, Margaret was noticeably absent from her usual patrol rounds. No measuring tape, no clipboard, no surprise visits to document violations. But I knew this was just the calm before a bigger storm. Monday morning brought vindication. My father called me at work, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "James, I thought you should know. The Thornfields came in for their loan review this morning. How did that go?" "Well, they're 3 months behind on their mortgage, 2 months behind on their home equity payments, and their credit score has dropped 40 points since their last review. Normally, we'd be starting foreclosure proceedings." My heart jumped. Normally. However, I explained to the review committee that sometimes good families go through temporary rough patches, and that stable community relationships are often a good indicator of future stability. I recommended we offer them a 6-month payment deferral program. That's generous. It seemed like the right thing to do, especially since I mentioned that their recent community involvement seemed to be resolving itself positively. Dad chuckled. Margaret was very grateful, very cooperative. She even mentioned something about reviewing HOA enforcement policies to make sure they're fair and consistent. That afternoon, Margaret appeared at our front door for the third time, but this visit was completely different. Gone was the predatory smile and clipboard. She looked tired, almost defeated. "James, I owe you an apology." "Oh?" "I've been reviewing our HOA enforcement practices, and I realize I may have been overly enthusiastic about certain regulations." She shifted uncomfortably. "The parking restriction you were cited for is actually intended for commercial vehicles, not family cars. I misinterpreted the language." I waited. There had to be more. "I'm also implementing a new policy of consistent enforcement throughout the community. No more selective application of rules." She pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a formal withdrawal of all citations against your family, along with a full refund of any fines paid." "That's very reasonable, Margaret. There's one more thing." She looked genuinely pained. "I'd like to propose a community meeting next Saturday to discuss updating our HOA regulations. Some of these rules are outdated and unnecessarily restrictive. I think it's time for Willowbrook Estates to become a more family-friendly community." After she left, Sarah emerged from the kitchen where she'd been listening to the entire conversation. "What just happened?" she asked. "Justice," I said simply. "Sometimes bullies need to learn that other people have power too." The following Saturday, Margaret held the most productive HOA meeting in Willowbrook Estates history. Nearly every family in the neighborhood attended, and for the first time ever, people felt free to voice their opinions without fear of retaliation. We voted to eliminate 17 outdated regulations, including the parking restriction that had started this whole mess. We established clear guidelines for consistent enforcement and created an appeal process for disputed violations. Most importantly, we elected a new board with representatives from different parts of the community, ending Margaret's one-woman rule. Margaret herself seemed almost relieved to share the responsibility. Later, I learned from Derek that the stress of trying to control an entire neighborhood had been eating her alive, along with their financial problems. 3 months later, Willowbrook Estates was a completely different community. The changes went far beyond just HOA politics. People were actually talking to each other again. Mrs. Patterson, the woman with the dog grooming business, got proper permits and turned her hobby into a legitimate neighborhood service. The Johnsons' hot tub became the centerpiece of monthly community barbecues. Margaret's famous rose garden, properly relocated to stay within her property boundaries, won the neighborhood's first ever Community Beautiful Award. My parents resumed their regular visits, parking confidently in our driveway while Mom helped with baby Emma, and Dad continued his weekend yard work projects. But the biggest change was in Margaret herself. About 6 weeks after the loan review, she stopped by our house again, but this time it was to apologize properly and to share some news. "James, I wanted to thank you and your father," she said, sitting in our living room with a cup of Sarah's coffee. "That loan deferral program saved our house. I'm glad things worked out. More than that, It gave Derek and me time to really look at our finances and make some changes. We were so focused on keeping up appearances that we'd gotten completely over our heads. She smiled, genuinely this time. Derek got a second job. I'm doing freelance accounting from home, and we've actually got a budget now. Financial stress can make people do things they normally wouldn't, I said diplomatically. Margaret nodded. I was trying so hard to prove I was a good HOA president that I became exactly the kind of neighbor I always hated. The power went to my head, and I lost sight of what communities are supposed to be about. Over the following months, Margaret transformed from neighborhood tyrant to community builder. She organized the first annual Willowbrook Estates Family Fun Day, started a community garden program, and even helped establish a neighborhood childcare co-op that made life easier for working parents. The loan deferral program had given her family breathing room to get back on their feet, and removing the stress of trying to control everyone else's lives had given her back her humanity. My father, meanwhile, became something of a neighborhood legend. Word had gotten around about his role in resolving the parking dispute, though the details remained vague. Other families started banking with First National, appreciating his reputation for fairness and community support. You know, Dad told me one evening, as we watched Emma play in our front yard, while his car sat proudly in our driveway, I spent 30 years in banking, thinking my job was just about numbers and risk assessment. But sometimes, the most important thing you can do is help good people through tough times. Even when those people start out as bullies, especially then. Bullies usually become bullies because they're scared of losing control of something. Margaret was scared of losing her house, her status, her sense of importance. When you address the fear instead of fighting the behavior, you often get better results. The final vindication came 6 months later when Willowbrook Estates was featured in a regional magazine as an example of successful community transformation. The article highlighted our collaborative approach to neighborhood governance and our family-friendly policies. Margaret, now serving as community events coordinator rather than HOA president, was quoted extensively about the importance of neighbors supporting each other through challenges rather than tearing each other down. But my favorite moment came during our second annual Family Fun Day. I was manning the barbecue grill when I saw my parents arrive, parking confidently in our driveway, just as they had for years. Mom walked slowly but steadily to where Sarah was watching Emma play, while Dad headed over to help me with the food. Margaret, carrying a tray of her famous potato salad, paused next to my parents' car and smiled. Not her old fake smile, but a real expression of contentment. "You know what I learned from all this, James?" she said, setting the tray on our picnic table. "What's that?" "The strongest communities aren't built by following every rule perfectly. They're built by people who care enough about each other to find solutions instead of problems." She gestured toward our driveway, where my parents' car sat among several others belonging to neighbors who'd stopped by. "Your family parking in your own driveway was never a problem. My attitude was the problem." As the day went on, I watched kids playing on our lawn while parents talked and laughed together. Margaret was teaching some of the younger neighbors how to properly prune roses. Derek was helping my dad set up the sound system for later activities. This was what community was supposed to feel like, people supporting each other instead of looking for reasons to fight. The whole experience taught me something important about power and conflict resolution. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to fight them directly, but to address the underlying insecurity that's driving their behavior. Margaret had been lashing out because she felt powerless in her own life, so she'd tried to control everyone else's. But when my father showed her that other people had power too, the power to help or hurt, to support or abandon, she'd been forced to reevaluate her approach. The loan deferral hadn't just saved her house. It had shown her that cooperation worked better than domination. As the sun set on our neighborhood celebration, I felt genuinely grateful for the whole experience. What had started as a ridiculous fight over parking spaces had transformed our entire community for the better. And every time my parents visit now, parking confidently in our driveway, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important victories aren't about winning fights, They're about building relationships that make fights unnecessary. Margaret may have banned my family from parking in our own driveway, but in the end, my father's quiet demonstration of power had banned something much more destructive from our neighborhood, the kind of petty tyranny that makes communities feel like battlefields instead of homes. The best part? Everyone won in the end, including Margaret herself.